3 words. That was all it took. And every man in that yard that morning would spend the rest of his days making peace with what came after. I was there, friend, propped against a cottonwood not 40 yards from the Whitmore Spring, and I saw every last piece of it happen. Saw those riders fan out around a young woman who hadn't done a thing to earn it. Saw the sheriff dip his hat brim like he was at a Sunday social instead of a shakedown. Saw the preacher fold his hands and suddenly find the dirt at his boots fascinating. And I saw the man in the sun-faded poncho, somewhere near 30, dust ground into every fold of his clothing, sitting a red roan mare that badly needed water. He came in easy, no hurry. Took one glance at the scene and said it plain, "Leave her be." They left. It was the worst call they ever made. Her name was Clara Whitmore. And the spring on her land, sitting cold and steady in Haskell County, New Mexico territory, through the blistering August heat of 1883, was the only dependable water for 50 miles in every direction. Her father, old Thomas Whitmore, had grasped what that spring meant the way a chess master understands his queen. It was the one piece that made every other piece matter. His herd drank while others were hauling from cracked creek beds. His neighbors always seemed to owe him a favor. He'd built his whole outfit on that cold, patient fact. He'd gone in June, no warning at all. His heart quit somewhere between breakfast and midday, and left the ranch to his daughter and whatever grit she'd inherited from him. She had no shortage of it. What Clara didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the road-worn stranger riding up from the south carried a past that would have changed the whole temperature of that confrontation, had any of those men recognized him. They were about to learn the hard way. If you're new here, friend, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. And before we ride on, leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. What's the hour where you are? I always like knowing who's riding along with me. Now, back to that August morning. Back to the spring. Thomas Whitmore had carved the rocking W out of raw labor and pure stubbornness. 30 years working Haskell County dirt, hauling water, mending fence line, burying cattle lost to brutal winters and worse luck. And somewhere along the way he'd found that spring, a cold, steady seep opening into a rock basin the size of a wagon bed that had never once run dry, not even through the territory's cruelest droughts. He'd cleared it by hand, lined it with flat stone, built a catch trough. To him, it was never just water. It was the reason the whole operation stayed standing. He had one child, Clara, raised alongside him in the saddle, poring over his ledgers by lantern light, learning every acre of that land through repetition and instinct. She was 23 when he passed, dark-haired, gray-eyed just like him, with a temper she mostly kept on a short leash. Not a fragile woman by any measure, but suddenly she was alone on a ranch drawing a great deal of unwanted attention. That attention had a name. Garrett Pruitt. He ran the Consolidated Grazing Company out of a brick office in Las Cruces, and what he wanted out of this stretch of territory wasn't complicated. Water. Not for his own thirst. The Southern Pacific line was due through Haskell County inside of 2 years, and every rancher within 20 miles knew that whoever controlled the reliable water along that right-of-way would control the beef supply for every crew from there to El Paso, contracts worth more than most men see in a lifetime. Pruitt had spent months buying up water rights, quiet and methodical. 3 outfits sold without a fight. 2 more folded when their credit dried up overnight at the only bank in Cutter Creek, mysteriously, suddenly, completely. One holdout rancher woke to find his winter hay burned to ash come October. He was on a stage to Albuquerque before November hit. Pruitt never laid a hand on any of it himself. That was the beauty of having the right men in the right chairs. Sheriff Dale Huck wore the badge in Haskell County, and that badge served Pruitt's interests as faithfully as a well-trained hound serves its master. Huck wasn't a fool. He understood a territorial appointment only holds as firm as the recommendation behind it, and his recommendation had come straight from Garrett Pruitt. So when Pruitt's men needed the law looking the other way, the law looked the other way. Huck had built himself enough private justifications by now that he'd mostly stopped feeling the weight of it. The preacher was a softer strain of the same corruption. Father Donald Kemp ran the only church in Cutter Creek, and Pruitt had paid for the new roof and the stained glass St. Francis window Kemp liked to boast about. Kemp had never once asked where that money came from. He told himself good works could still be built on money from bad places. He'd told himself that often enough it had hardened into something resembling belief. Pruitt's enforcer was a gun for hire out of Abilene named Willis Rand, a reputation that rode in ahead of him like smoke ahead of a fire. 3 kills on record, 2 of them ugly even by frontier standards. 28 years old, quiet in the particular way certain men go quiet, not from calm but from practice. Fast with a pistol, and drawn to work for men like Pruitt because it suited exactly what he was. When Thomas Whitmore died and Clara refused to sell, Pruitt gave her 60 days. Then he sent Rand and 4 riders out to the Rocking W for what he liked to call a persuasion visit. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of August day that presses down on a person. Sky bleached white with heat, dust hanging in the air even where nothing stirred it. Clara had been down at the spring since first light, topping off the trough, when she spotted them crossing the flat from half a mile out. She set her back against the stone basin and waited. 5 riders. Rand out front. 2 consolidated men flanking him. Behind, keeping their distance, Sheriff Huck on a gray gelding, Father Kemp on a mule. The preacher hadn't wanted to ride out. But Pruitt had asked him personally, and Kemp had learned by now that a personal request from Pruitt wasn't really a request. They reined up 10 yards from the spring, and Rand looked at Clara the way a man eyes an obstacle he's already decided to clear out of his way. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Mr. Pruitt's been more than patient. He'll still pay you a fair price. But this gets settled today one way or another." Her father's Winchester leaned against the stone trough 6 feet behind her, set there the moment she'd first spotted them coming. Close enough. Not in her hands yet. She kept her hands visible and her voice steady. "My answer hasn't changed," she said. "Not in 2 months. Not in 4. This land isn't for sale." Rand glanced sideways at the riders flanking him. A thick-necked man named Doyle nudged his horse forward and closed a hand around Clara's wrist, not roughly, just enough to make a point about who was in charge of that yard. And then, hoofbeats from the south trail, unhurried. A red roan mare. A man in a faded, sage-colored poncho, dust worked into everything from his boot heels to his hat brim, an empty canteen rattling against his saddle, lean maybe 31 or 32, dark eyes sweeping the scene without a flicker of alarm, just a slight tightening at the jaw. He rode up to the edge of the group and stopped. Took in Doyle's grip on Clara's wrist. Took in the sheriff. Took in the preacher. Then settled his eyes on Rand. "Leave her be." Rand turned toward him with the mild irritation of a man who's just noticed a stray dog wander into his camp. "Move along, friend. This is private business." The stranger didn't budge. His mare shifted a step, stretched her neck toward the trough. He let her drink and sat there watching Doyle's hand still fastened to Clara's wrist. "Let her go," he said. "Last time I'll ask nice." Something shifted in Rand's face then. Not quite fear, not yet, but the look of a man taking in information that didn't line up with what he'd expected, quietly recalculating. The stranger wasn't backing off, and he wasn't puffing himself up either. He just sat there while his horse drank, waiting, like he'd already worked out how this ended and felt no rush getting there. "You've got some nerve for a man on a thirsty horse," Rand said. "Horse is getting her water," the man answered. "Your boys are the ones who ought to be worried." Rand's hand started drifting toward his belt. What came next? Friend, nobody who saw it could ever properly piece it back together afterward, and I was standing right there. One instant, the man in the poncho sat easy, both hands resting on the horn of his saddle. The next, a single shot split the August stillness and Willis Rand's gun hand burst red, and he doubled over screaming while his revolver, barely clear of the holster, spun off into the dirt. Doyle let go of Clara's wrist like it had scalded him. The 2 flanking riders froze so completely they might have been carved from stone. Nobody made a move. Nobody made a sound except Rand, cursing through ragged breath, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. The stranger hadn't shifted an inch in his saddle. A thin curl of smoke rose off the old Colt in his hand before he slid it back into the holster in one smooth motion, easy as tucking a letter back in its envelope. "He's still breathing," he said, to nobody in particular. "That was on purpose." He looked at the sheriff. Huck had gone the color of dead ash. "You planning to do your job today," the man said quietly, "or keep doing his?" He tipped his head toward the direction Pruitt's men had ridden in from. Huck said nothing. He looked at the preacher next. Kemp's eyes were locked on his mule's reins. "Knuckles white on the leather. Preacher," the man said, "you're going to lose sleep tonight over this." Then he turned to the remaining riders and delivered his last word the way a man reports the weather. "Now get off this land." They got off the land. Rand, bent and hissing, let another rider lead his horse by the reins. They rode south toward Cutter Creek, and the hoofbeats faded, and the cottonwoods along the spring stopped shaking, and Clara Whitmore stood by the stone basin with her father's Winchester in her hands now, watching the last of them vanish over the rise. She looked at the stranger. "That was Willis Rand," she said. "Out of Abilene. I know who he is." "You shot his gun hand." "I did." She studied him a moment. "Care to tell me your name?" He hesitated. "Cal Devereaux. I needed water for my horse." He swung down and led the mare to the trough and let her finish drinking. "Now, friend, before we ride on any further tonight, if this story's earned your time, tap that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. And drop me a comment. Tell me where you're at right now and what hour it is. Somewhere out west on a long drive? Tucked into bed back east trying to let the day go? Tell me. We've had folks writing in from places that would genuinely surprise you. Pour yourself something warm. Let's find out just who Cal Devereaux really was. The name Cal Devereaux meant nothing at all to Clara Whitmore. It meant a great deal to certain men scattered across 4 territories in Texas. 10 years earlier, at 21, Devereaux had taken a deputy's badge in Laredo under a federal marshal named Clarence Poe. For 6 years, he ran down fugitives across country that would kill a careless man without effort, brought in rustlers and killers and men worse than either, and built the kind of reputation that gets built quietly, through the accounts of men who'd seen what he could do and made certain they weren't around the next time his name came up. He was fast. That was the plain word for it. The fastest draw most witnesses ever laid eyes on. And he carried the particular patience that separates the good lawman from the rest, the kind that lets a man sit through an entire day waiting for the one moment when waiting stops being the right move. Then came a place called Cañon Rojo, a mining camp up in the Himes Mountains. A man named Latimer who'd looted a payroll strongbox through a contact Devereaux had trusted. 9 miners died in what followed. Devereaux had gone after Latimer alone, against Marshal Poe's direct order, tracked him 3 days, and brought him back slung over his own saddle. But the miners stayed dead. Their families stayed without husbands and fathers. Devereaux carried that the way a man carries something stitched into his coat lining. Always there. Never any lighter. Since Cañon Rojo, he'd drifted a wide loop, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, down through the territory, taking work wherever it needed doing and moving along before anyone could pin a lasting name to him. He wasn't running exactly, but he was searching for something, though if you'd pressed him to name it, he'd have come up short. He'd heard about the Whitmore Spring from a stage driver 2 weeks back, who'd mentioned the consolidated outfit and a young woman who'd refused every bit of pressure they'd thrown at her. Something about that story had tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite explain, so he'd turned the roan south and followed the pull. He didn't unpack all of it for Clara at once. He gave her pieces of it that evening, sitting on the porch steps while the light drained out of the sky in stages, copper first, then gray. She sat in her father's chair with the Winchester across her lap and listened without cutting in, which he found he appreciated, more than he expected to. "You shot Willis Rand's." "Hand," she said again once he'd finished, still sitting with it. "I've never killed a man unless—" There wasn't any way around it, he said. Rand hadn't reached that point yet. Might decide tomorrow to be a different kind of man. Probably won't, but that wasn't mine to decide for him. "They'll come back," Clara said. "With more men." "Yes," Devereaux agreed. "Pruitt's got money. Men like Rand are easy enough to replace. He'll send 6 next time or 10, and he won't ride out himself, because men like him never do." Clara went quiet, watching the last color bleed out of the western sky. "You don't have to stay," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't," he stayed. He took the small tack room off the barn, a cot, a lantern, nothing else, and spent that first night cleaning his pistol and thinking things through. Before dawn, he walked the whole perimeter in the gray half-light and marked 3 ways a man could come at the place that worried him: the dry wash to the west, the tree line along the north fence, and a low rise behind the barn offering a clean rifle shot at the house from 300 yards out. He fixed those in his mind the way a man memorizes ground he already knows he'll be fighting on. That day he spent with Clara taking stock. Wire. Lumber, hinges on the barn door, shutters on the house, sightlines from the spring across the yard. She knew that ground better than he ever would. And she pointed out things he'd have walked straight past. A second water source he hadn't noticed. A dry stone root cellar dug into the hillside, invisible unless you already knew where to look. The way the cottonwoods along the creek formed a natural wall that slowed any approach on horseback from the east. She was sharp in the way that mattered out here. Not just schooled, though she'd gotten some of that from her mother before her mother passed, but land sharp. That deep, particular understanding only earned by growing up on one piece of ground and letting it teach you everything it knows. Devereaux had known men who'd worked a spread 20 years and still didn't read it the way. Clara read the Rocking W at 23. That afternoon, she showed him a ledger, not the ranch's regular books. A separate one, hidden beneath the floorboards of her father's office. A room barely bigger than a closet off the main house. 3 years of entries, careful and exact. Every time Pruitt's name had come up in conversation. Every neighbor who'd sold under pressure. Every visit from consolidated writers, dates, and figures noted wherever he could pin them down. Thomas Whitmore hadn't been sitting idle. He'd been gathering proof, slow and quiet, without fanfare, because he'd believed, the way men of his generation sometimes believed, with something close to religious conviction, that the law eventually catches up with the men who think they're above it. He was building a case, Devereaux said, turning the pages carefully at the kitchen table. He always said the law gets there eventually, Clara said. He just didn't live to see it. Devereaux looked up at her. Something crossed his face, the look of a man who's been hauling a heavy weight and just spotted a place he might finally set it down. Where's the nearest federal marshal's office? Santa Fe, 3 days' ride. Devereaux looked back down at the ledger, then reached inside his poncho and set a small leather document case on the table beside it. What's that? Clara asked. My credentials, he said. I'm not just some drifter, Miss Whitmore. I rode for the Federal Marshal Service 6 years. I've got contacts in Santa Fe and I've had my eye on Garrett Pruitt for 4 months now. He told her the rest of it then. How he'd been chasing a separate lead, a railroad commissioner up in Colorado who'd taken bribes to steer the Southern Pacific Survey through land friendly to Consolidated, and how that thread had wound its way south to Haskell County. He had his own notes, a written statement from a former Consolidated bookkeeper who'd fled to Tucson and put down everything he'd seen from inside the operation. Names, dates, figures. The full shape of it. What he hadn't had until Clara's father's ledger was the local proof tying Pruitt's campaign to specific acts against specific landowners in this county. Together, the two records were exactly the sort of thing a territorial judge could act on. He isn't just buying up water rights, Devereaux said. He's bribing a federal railroad commissioner. He's using unlawful force against private landowners. He's turned a county sheriff into his personal tool. That's federal jurisdiction. That's the kind of case that reaches the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe and doesn't come back until people are wearing chains. Clara sat with that a long moment. Why didn't you say any of this morning? This morning I didn't know about your father's ledger, Devereaux said. I knew what I had. I didn't know what you had. She almost smiled, brief, not quite reaching her eyes, but there. So what do we do now? We get through the next 48 hours, he said. Then we get these papers to Santa Fe. The night passed without trouble, though neither of them slept easy. Devereaux sat on the barn roof from midnight till dawn, rifle across his knees, listening to the land settle and breathe. An owl somewhere in the cottonwoods, coyotes off to the north. And once, near 3 a.m, hoofbeats on the south trail that slowed, stopped, then came no closer. A scout, most likely. He let them look. Let them count windows and run their numbers. At first light, he came down, built a small fire, put coffee on. Clara came out of the house, hair still pinned from the night, and took the mug he handed her without a word. They drank it together in silence while the sun climbed and turned the flats from pale gray to gold. Tell me what's coming, she said. He laid it out plain. Pruitt would have word about Rand before supper the evening before. He'd know at once that whoever had disarmed his hired gun wasn't some random drifter. The confidence alone told him that much, even without a name. He'd move fast, because men like Pruitt understood their whole operation rested on the scaffolding of fear, and fear is a fragile thing. The moment people in Cutter Creek started passing around the story of Willis Rand getting taken down in a woman's yard, the entire structure Pruitt had spent years building would start to crack. He'll want this settled before the story spreads further, Devereaux said, which means today or tonight at the latest. Then we'd better be ready by noon, Clara said. They spent the morning getting ready. Devereaux strung a length of wire across the dry wash at roughly chest height for a mounted rider, not to throw anyone, but to slow them down and give warning. He stacked split wood against the barn's north wall to break up the sightline from the rise. Clara set herself up in the root cellar with her father's Winchester, a clean view of the whole yard, and 2 boxes of ammunition from the floor safe she only mentioned then, which Devereaux chose not to comment on, since she'd told him the moment it actually mattered. Around midday, Father Kemp rode up on his mule, alone, hands in plain sight. He pulled up 20 feet from the house and called Clara's name. She stepped onto the porch with the Winchester in hand, not quite pointed at him. The preacher said he'd come to warn her. Pruitt had 6 riders heading out that afternoon. Rand's replacement was a man called Caulfield, from what Kemp had overheard. A different breed entirely, colder, more businesslike, no interest in theater. And Pruitt, Kemp said, was finished making offers. Why tell me this? Clara asked. Kemp was quiet a moment, looking down at the reins in his hands. A small man who'd made what he'd always told himself were small decisions, and had only just understood they hadn't been small at all. You could see that understanding sitting on him like something heavy he'd just picked up for the first time. Because your father was a good man, he said finally, and I've been telling myself for a long time that what I do is somehow separate from what Pruitt does. I know now that's a lie. Devereaux stepped out of the barn doorway into the sunlight. Kemp looked at him and something crossed the preacher's face, recognition or close to it. I know your name, Kemp said quietly. I served a parish in Laredo 2 years before I came here. Then you know I'm not stretching the truth, Devereaux said. And there's something I need from you. He handed Kemp a sealed letter written before dawn, 2 pages in careful script, addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe. He told Kemp to ride there straight, to hand over that letter along with Thomas Whitmore's ledger to the duty marshal, and to say that Calvin Devereaux was requesting urgent help in Haskell County, New Mexico Territory. Kemp held the letter a long moment without speaking. Then he tucked it away. If I do this, he said, Pruitt will know it was me. Yes, Devereaux said. He will. Kemp folded his coat over the envelope and looked at Clara. Your father used to talk about the territory catching up with itself eventually, he said. He talked about it the way a man talks about something he truly believes. He did believe it, Clara said. Kemp turned his mule south and rode off. Devereaux watched him go without a word. Whether the preacher would follow through was outside his control entirely. He had his own copies, his own contacts. But Santa Fe sat 3 days off, and Pruitt's men were coming that very afternoon. So he let go of what he couldn't manage and turned his full attention to what he could. They arrived at 4 that afternoon, not at night, just as he'd figured, which told him something about Caulfield's confidence. 6 riders splitting their approach between south and west at once, spreading out as they crested the rise. Caulfield was easy to spot, riding a bit apart from the rest at a measured pace, carrying himself like a man who treats violence as a job rather than a grudge. Devereaux waited inside the barn. Clara waited in the root cellar. Neither moved as the riders took their positions. Caulfield reined up at the yard's edge and spent a full minute reading the property. He'd been told about 1 man and 1 woman, and he wasn't the sort of professional who took a briefing at face value. He sat his horse, studied the layout, and waited. When nothing gave itself away, he called out, Devereaux, I know you're here. My employer's got an offer. Devereaux walked out of the barn with both hands empty and visible. I don't need to hear it. $50,000, Caulfield said, for you and the woman to clear out of this county and never come back. That's a lot of money for a drifter. I'm not a drifter. And he knows I've already assembled the federal bribery case. You think $50,000 makes me forget a railroad commissioner in Colorado and a bookkeeper's sworn statement out of Tucson? Caulfield took that in without much show, adjusting, recalculating, the way a skilled hand does when the first play doesn't land. Then there's nothing left to discuss, he said. No, Devereaux agreed. There isn't. What happened in the next 3 minutes, friend? Folks in Haskell County were still arguing over 20 years later, by which time most of the witnesses had gone gray, and the details had shifted with each retelling, Caulfield's hand went for his gun. It never got there. Devereaux drew, and the shot caught Caulfield's gun hand at almost the exact spot it had caught Rand's the morning before, a quarter-inch lower. In fact, since Caulfield was slightly quicker and the angle was a touch different, and Devereaux adjusted for both without any conscious thought at all, the way a craftsman working at the edge of his skill runs purely on instinct. The revolver spun off into the dust. Caulfield folded over his saddle. Two things happened next that Pruitt's riders hadn't accounted for. The wire strung across the dry wash caught the flanking pair at chest height as they tried to circle around the far side of the barn, not hard enough to unseat them, but enough to snarl their horses in a tangle of backing and spooking that killed any clean line of fire for half a minute. And from the root cellar, a rifle round buried in the dirt 4 feet ahead of the rider coming in from the north. Then a voice, calm and unhurried, carrying clean through the sudden hush. Next one goes through your horse's knee. The one after that goes through you. Clara Whitmore had her father's eye and her father's nerve, and there wasn't a hint of bluff anywhere in her voice. The rider on the north side hauled his animal to a stop so hard it nearly sat down under him. Nobody moved. Caulfield hung bent over his saddle, his hand ruined. The two caught in the wire were still fighting free of it. The remaining 3 sat very still, working the math in their heads and not much liking the answer. Devereaux walked toward Caulfield's horse. Go tell Pruitt, he said. I've got the ledger. I've got the bookkeeper's statement. I've got Father Kemp riding to Santa Fe right now with everything we've put together. And if he wants to know who I am, he can ask Dale Huck, because Huck knows exactly what happens to men who step in front of me. He paused. Tell him it's over. Caulfield looked up at him through what was plainly considerable pain. He won't take that. He will, Devereaux said. Once the marshals get here, they rode off in 6 horses heading south, and then quiet settled over the rocking W again. The cottonwoods along the spring stood still in the windless afternoon. Somewhere above, a hawk turned slow, easy circles, indifferent to the whole affair. The marshals rode in on a Friday morning. 3 days after Father Kemp had pointed his mule down the south road, 2 deputy U.S. marshals out of Santa Fe, a federal warrant folded inside one man's coat, and a rider Devereaux recognized from his years under Marshal Poe, a man named Garza, who shook his hand in the yard and said plainly, "Good timing on that letter." The federal warrant named Garrett Pruitt and Sheriff Dale Huck as co-conspirators in a scheme involving bribery of a railroad commissioner, coordinated coercion of private landowners through threatened destruction of property, and the corruption of a county law office for private gain. Thomas Whitmore's ledger was the foundation of it. The bookkeeper's statement out of Tucson gave it context. Devereaux's own testimony connected the rest. Huck was arrested at his desk in Cutter Creek that same afternoon. He didn't put up a fight. He'd likely known it was coming since that morning at the spring. There was something in his face when Garza read out the warrant, a tired, worn-down relief, as if part of him had been waiting on it and wasn't altogether sorry it had finally come. Pruitt was taken the next morning at his brick office in Las Cruces. He walked out the front door in a pressed suit demanding his lawyer and was told he'd have counsel waiting in Santa Fe. He looked smaller than his reputation. That's the part Devereaux always remembered. How small the men who cast the longest shadows always turned out to be once you finally saw them standing in plain daylight. Huck lost his badge and was hauled off to Albuquerque to await trial. Consolidated Grazing's claims across Haskell County were frozen pending investigation, a process that dragged on 2 years but eventually returned 3 seized properties to their rightful owners. Garrett Pruitt served 18 months in federal prison and died broke at 61 in an Albuquerque boarding house, which, as a rule, friend, is about where men like Garrett Pruitt tend to end up. The money never outlives the reckoning. Father Donald Kemp testified for the prosecution and was granted clemency for it. He resigned his church in Cutter Creek before the trial even started, on his own accord, before anyone had to ask, and nobody who'd known him through the Pruitt years said much against it. He moved to a small mission outside Taos and spent the following decade teaching children their letters, which, taking the full measure of a life, isn't the worst way a man could spend what's left of his. Cal Devereaux stayed on at the Rocking W 10 days after the marshals arrived. Long enough to see the property secured. Long enough to watch the new county sheriff, appointed by the territorial government to replace Huck, actually ride into Haskell County and show some sign of meaning to do his job. He helped Clara mend the south fence where the wire had torn loose, helped her rehang the barn door, drank her coffee each morning, and they talked mostly about the land and what she meant to do with it. Sometimes about his years writing for Poe, rarely about what might come next for either of them. On the morning of the 11th day, he saddled the roan and led her around to the yard. Clara stepped out onto the porch. "You could stay," she said. He looked at her. She stood holding her father's coffee mug in both hands, her gray eyes steady and direct. She wasn't asking. Wasn't tipping the scale one way or the other. Just stating a fact and leaving the rest up to him, which he found he respected more than almost anything else she could have done. "You don't need me here," he said. "You know that." She weighed arguing the point. Decided it was true. "Where are you headed?" He looked west, toward the long, flat line where the territory gave way to something else, the pale morning sky just starting to warm. "There's a man in Tucson who's been dodging a federal summons for 3 years, he said. "Been meaning to have a word with him." Clara went quiet. "Then maybe the thing you've been chasing," she said. "Since Cañon Rojo, I think you might have already found it." He held her gaze a moment. Something crossed his face, unplanned, arriving without his say-so. "Maybe," he said. He swung up into the saddle. The roan turned south without any urging. "Cal," Clara said. He looked back. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the shooting. For staying." He touched his hat brim, then rode south and west into the pale morning, and the sound of hooves on hard ground faded away. And the cottonwoods along the spring stirred once in the first breath of wind, and the rocking W went quiet. And the spring stayed cold and clear, exactly where it had always been. Clara Whitmore held that ranch for the next 42 years. When the rail line finally came through in 1886, the water rights Pruitt had spent years trying to seize by force became the single most valuable asset in Haskell County. She managed that advantage with a precision that would have made her father sit up a little straighter. She never once sold the spring outright. She leased it on her own terms at rates she set to people who understood plainly that they were guests at her table. Every dollar that came from those arrangements went toward 2 things her father had talked about for years, without ever having the means to see through. A schoolhouse built in the rocking W Valley in 1889, and a small infirmary in Cutter Creek that opened its doors in 1891 and stayed running for 60 years. She ran them both. And every August, on the date a man in a faded poncho had ridden in off the South Trail and spoken 3 words that changed the whole direction of things, she set 2 cups out on the porch come morning. She drank one. She left the other. "Now, friend, here we are at the end of it. And I want to tell you what I've carried with me out of that August morning in Haskell County, all these years since. Because I was there, like I told you, leaned up against that cottonwood, watching the whole thing play out. What sticks with me isn't the shooting, though the shooting was as fast as anything I've ever laid eyes on before or since. What sticks with me is the preacher. Not the moment he gave his warning. Not even the ride to Santa Fe. It's the moment he stood in that yard and spoke plainly about the story he'd been telling himself, because that's the part worth paying attention to, friend. The story you tell yourself. The one that dresses up a slow, quiet surrender as though it were standing still. Evil isn't always theatrical. It isn't always a man in a fine suit behind a brick office door. Sometimes it's a man wearing a cross, studying the ground at his boots because looking down costs less than looking up. Sometimes it's a badge pinned to a man who traded away his purpose long ago for a comfortable arrangement and has been calling it something else ever since. And the man who sets that right doesn't always ride in with a legend ahead of him. Sometimes he just needs water for his horse and he sees what he sees and he says what he says. 3 words. And what follows those 3 words, that's the whole story. Every single time. Thank you for riding along with me tonight, friend. If this one landed with you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. And tell me down in the comments where you're at tonight, what time it is, what's sitting in your cup. We read every single one of those and they matter more than you'd guess. Until our trails cross again. Keep your powder dry and your conscience clean. This story is a work of fiction drawn from the spirit and history of the American frontier. All characters, events, and locations are fictional. AI tools were used in the production of this content.